Hey folks, and welcome back to Fireside Farms. It is the beginning of September, and although it's still pretty warm during the day here on my desert homestead, it is about time to start thinking about fall planting. Now, I've already got tons of seedlings started indoors for my cool weather crops, such as broccoli, cabbage, cauliflower, and others, but there are some plants that you need to direct sow in the fall. Some of those are going to be peas, carrots, a lot of root vegetables need to be direct sown in the garden. So what I'm doing today is I'm tearing out my first summer garden bed, which is so sad, to make room for some peas. Now, I do have an upcoming video soon detailing exactly how I re-amend my garden beds for the fall after I take out the summer crops. That is not today, but I'm just going to give you an overview of what I'm doing with these old 1x4 bean beds that I have, how I'm going to amend them, and then how I plant peas for the fall garden. So let's go. First, we have to start by clearing out the space where I'm going to be putting my peas. This involves removing all of the edible beans from these current bean plants. This is a combination of both asparagus beans and pink-eye purple hull cowpeas. Although this trellis particularly has not been very productive over the last few weeks, I'm only getting maybe 1 or 2 asparagus beans per day. So I figured it was the perfect spot to start my peas since I had to remove something. So to remove these vines, I am going to cut the plants off at the base. And I'm doing this particularly with bean plants because they do fix nitrogen into the soil. And the way they do that is through nodules on their roots. So what I want to do when I remove these plants is just remove the foliage from the trellis, but actually leave the roots intact inside the soil so that as they break down, they add nitrogen to the soil. The rest of the bean plant foliage will go into a pile, which I'll put later in the compost. I do not give bean scraps, leaves, or foliage to my chickens. Dried beans and raw green beans contain lectins, a certain amount of a toxic compound, which is quickly reduced by boiling or cooking, and isn't so harmful that you should be worried about it as a human unless you're consuming very large amounts of raw dried beans or raw green beans. But for the chickens, I'm not entirely sure I always get all of the beans off these plants before I pull them, so just to be on the safe side, I put everything in the compost pile. And removing the vines from the trellis is usually just the hardest part of this whole process, since each vine twirls one stem around each one of these cattle panel lines. It takes quite a while to pull them all off without damaging the trellis or pulling it out of those stakes. But it can help if you go along with some scissors and cut perpendicular at every line across that cattle panel. They usually come off easier in chunks that way. Thankfully, there weren't that many vines on this trellis because the beans in these beds just didn't do very well this year. All of the old foliage is gone. It's time to actually dig into these garden beds and see what we've got. So all of this mulch on top, it contains old grass that has died, new grass that's trying to come through the bottom, old straw from the last mulching I did in the spring, and then there are tons of dead bean leaves that have just laid over the top. Now, a lot of that straw that I put on the top of here at the beginning of the spring season has since decomposed, both with just water and basic time, but a lot of it has to do with the roly-poly problem that I have as well. As I said before, roly-polies break down organic matter and then turn it basically into compost for your soil. But since there's not that much straw left and I don't currently have a bale of straw to use as mulch, I'm definitely going to retain all these bean leaves, these dried leaves, and use it as mulch for the peas this winter season. So the soil in these 1x4s is pretty dry and compacted. And a lot of that is my fault because these 2 beds right here don't have any drip irrigation to them. So I have to hand water them, which at the beginning of the summer I was doing every day, but since we're graduating into the fall and the beans were producing a lot less, I just kind of let it go. So that's partly why these are the first beds to go. out, and also because I need to plant peas, and this is a great spot for them because there's a trellis here, and I wasn't getting many beans off of the plants that were here to begin with. So what I'm going to do to fix this is, before I put any more soil into these beds, I am going to loosen it up a little bit with this little hand shovel, this little spade. I do practice a no-till method, which means at the end of every season I do not take a tiller or flip over the dirt in any way possible. I just let year after year of soil compost and just add like layers of a sandwich, and that way the soil microbes underneath don't get exposed to light and air, and it just becomes a rich biome of life. But you can introduce aeration into your soil and help alleviate compacted soils by reaching down into the soil and lightly lifting. In large no-till operations, you can use something called a broad fork, which is pretty big and will not fit in this 1x4 bed, nor do I own a broad fork. So what I'm going to do is just use this shovel and press it deep down into the soil and lightly pull up just to add some air into the lower depths. So as you can see, I'm not completely flipping over the soil, but I am bringing up chunks large enough to get air down into the depths below and just try and loosen up how compact this is. Another problem is that it's so dry. So when I add this topsoil over my current bed, I'm going to completely water this all the way through and make sure all of this soil in here is nice and moist for the brand new seeds. The 3 items I'm using for this amendment today is a potting mix, an all-purpose fertilizer by Happy Frog, and Sluggo Plus, which we'll get to later. Now normally I use the raised bed gardening mix, but they were all out at Home Depot, so I just bought a couple bags of potting mix, and I'm not too worried about it because I am only top dressing these beds. I am not filling a complete bed with soil, so it doesn't really matter. You don't want to use potting mix for an entire bed if you were completely filling it, but since I'm just top dressing about 1 inch, I'm not worried about it at all. I give about a handful of fertilizer before I put the new layer of soil on, and I mix that all in really good. And then once my soil is about to the level where I want it, which is a little less than 1 inch from the top of the bed, I will add another layer of fertilizer over the top. If I had other amendments like feather meal, bone meal, worm castings, etc., I would also be adding that in here, but since this fertilizer is all I've got today, that's what we're going to use, and that's why I'm kind of doubling it up here. Now that my soil is all done for this bed, I'm going to thoroughly water this bed in. As you saw before when I used the shovel, this is extremely dry soil and very compacted. I should have kept up on watering it, but it has been a very long growing season and I am very tired of my garden right now. So before I put any seeds in the ground, I do want to water all of this fertilizer in, all of this soil, because the soil is also going to change levels once you put water on it. It will sink down and compact a little, like every soil does when you water it. It's also helpful to water before you put seeds in. That way, especially if they are very shallow seeds that don't need a lot of depth when you plant them, you don't displace the seeds by having to water afterwards. By thoroughly watering all this dirt beforehand, we can ensure that the seeds I put in the ground will be adequately watered and they will be exactly where I put them when I planted them, and they won't get displaced by any further watering. Now that the beds are fully amended, it is time to plant my peas. Now, these peas are soaking in a jar of water, and if you've never heard of doing this, I highly recommend it, giving it a try for your bean seeds, Your pea seeds and nasturtiums are also a really good seed to soak before planting. Generally, you want to soak between 12 and 24 hours before you plant, and it just helps loosen up the outer shell of this pea seed so that it germinates a little bit more quickly. You do not want to waterlog these for days on end. They might rot or start fermenting, but definitely soaking them for at least 12 hours before you plant will greatly speed up germination and possibly help the process, especially if you live in a dry area like I do, where the soil has a tendency to dry out quickly, and if you're not on top of it, these seeds that you plant can germinate and then dry up really quickly if it's dry for an extended period of time. So I always soak my bean and pea seeds before planting, just to give myself a leg up in this hot, dry climate. So all legumes, beans, peas, alfalfa, they fix nitrogen in the soil. There are many other plants that are nitrogen fixers. But specifically, you can buy an inoculant, a legume inoculant, that will help the roots of these plants fix nitrogen. And if you have inoculated and planted in a space before, then your soil is already inoculated. You do not need to do this again. But in the case that you haven't, inoculating these with, I don't remember the name of the fungi that helps to fix the nitrogen right off the top of my head, but I'll put it down below. You definitely want to give this a try. It's just a powder. You can order it on Amazon or basically from any seed company. And you're going to soak these seeds in water and then take that powder and kind of like coat them with the powder once they're wet. Then you're going to plant them coated in that powder and you are done. That whole bed area is inoculated for the rest of eternity, as long as the bed is still there, and your plants will have an easier time fixing nitrogen, as well as it helps them grow a little bit better. So this soil that I have here is already inoculated. I have grown beans in here for 3 years and have put inoculant in it many times. So I'm not going to do it with these seeds. We're just going to go ahead and plant them. And I have got a ton of seeds here. I like to overplant my seeds just because of the roly-poly problem I have. So I'll split these into 2 halves and just put them everywhere in this garden bed. I want to say there's 15 seeds here. And then if they do all end up coming up and they're too close together, I can always thin them out later. So a rule of thumb for planting seeds, although most seed packets tell you how deep to go, you want to plant them twice as deep as they are wide. So basically 2 pea lengths down into the soil is where I want to put this pea seed. Sometimes it's easier to just spread them out and then push them down with your finger if you have a lot of seeds to work with at once, and then come back and cover up that hole that you put them in. And now that the soil is already wet, I won't have to come back over here and water and possibly displace the soil and how deep I put my seed. So that's another reason for watering before you actually put the seeds in. Now, because of my roly-poly problem and my inability to direct sow a lot of seeds because they just eat the seeds or the brand new seedlings that come up, I did go with this organic pesticide. That's the word I'm looking for. It's called Sluggo Plus. So the Sluggo brand mostly kills slugs and snails, but the Sluggo Plus version also kills earwigs and pill bugs, cutworms, sow bugs. It's just a pelletized version of iron phosphate and spinosad, and spinosad is an organic approved pesticide. They're tiny little pellets. Like, see if you can see these. And you're just gonna spread them around the base of the plant where you have an infestation. Frankly, I have an infestation all over my garden. I don't want to kill them indiscriminately because they do help break down organic plant matter, but I don't want them eating my seedlings. So throughout this whole 1x4 bed, I'm just gonna spread these little pellets, and hopefully they'll go after the pellets before they go after my seedlings or my seeds. We're gonna see. I have never tried this before, but I'm excited. This is a game changer if it means I can direct sow beans and peas without fear of losing half of 3/4 even of my crop. So now that these peas are planted, I will have to come out and hand water these 1x4 beds every day, which is fine. I'm very excited. I'm really hoping this pesticide works this year. I've just had no luck direct sowing in the past, but I'm very, very hopeful that I will actually get some peas this year. And although it is still a little warm, we're still in the 90s during the day. We're dropping down to the 60s at night, which is promising. It's a huge break for the plants not to be both hot day and night. Next week we have a couple forecasted days of rain and highs in the low 90s. So I do know that the temperature is slowly going down, and as long as it's hot, the peas will still germinate because it's cool at night. And they may not grow as well in the heat, but when they're little babies, it doesn't matter a whole lot. I still also have this shade cloth up, so that cuts down on the temperature in the actual garden. But all in all, I think this is a good time to plant. I'm very excited. My only issue is gonna be if these roly-polies come and eat all of my peas, but we're gonna find out. I'll keep you guys updated on the roly-poly situation and the pea situation. Yay! But I planted my first fall seeds. I'm so excited. Starting to feel like fall. Not like in the air because it's hot, but in the garden. I will do an in-depth video for you guys soon. I think probably within the next week, on how I amend my garden beds for fall planting. I do not have all of my soil amendments that I usually put in here today. So in these pea beds, I just put the basic fertilizer that I use. But I will have an in-depth video on that coming soon once I figure out which bed of plants I want to kill first. I haven't decided yet. But yeah, stay tuned for that, and thanks for hanging out with me today. I will catch you on the next one.